A few weeks ago, we took a look at contrast and how we were able to play around with the brightness, the contrast. We were looking at histograms and those little flat spots on the end and how we could pull things around. And I talked about the idea of thinking of the gray tones, you know, from 0 all the way up to 255, from black all the way up to white, as an elastic string with a bunch of glass beads on it. And we're going to extend that thought a little bit further today. If you go into the folder by the numbers, we're going to take a look at doing color corrections, not brightness and contrast changes. But if you think about it, a color correction is a lot like a brightness change. If you've got a photograph and it's got a little bit of a reddish cast to it, and you're like, I better take some of that red out, you would go into an individual color channel. You go to, say, the red channel, grab that middle bead and pull it to the left or the right. By reducing or increasing the brightness of the red channel, you're removing or adding red to that image. So really, a color correction is just a brightness or contrast change in one color channel. And we're going to take a look at changing colors by the numbers. Open up the folder called By the Numbers and the file called squaredance.psd. And you'll find in there a bunch of colored squares. Imagine we got to make everything match this color. This is your 50% gray in here. And let's say you're doing a job for the Bay and they've got some clothing that's coming in. And they know that, okay, this shirt is supposed to be this color. In this case, this is what we're going to match everything to. And we're going to look at the tools we can use to match up these colors. But we want to do it non-destructively. Let's take a look at this square over here. And the instructions say, use levels to match color. All right. Well, first off, we've got to figure out what color that is. What might be a good way of getting the RGB values of that square? Give this a try. Go under Window and call up Info. We're going to use the Info panel for this. So under Window, Info. And when you hover over that square, it'll show you its RGB values. Now, another thing to take a look at, I guess, is what we're trying to match it to. What are the RGB values of this square here, this 50% gray? 128, 128, 128. Interesting. Notice that they're all the same right across the red, the green, the blue. They're all the same. And it's 50% gray. And we go from 0 to 255. What's right in the middle? Oh, 128. So this is your 50% gray, a special color for a lot of reasons. One of them is soft light dodging and burning. Soft light, 50% gray does nothing. But to make this one match that, well, what's the problem with it? What's gone wrong? It's not 128, 128, 128. What was it again? It was 199. Oh, 199. So that's closer to 255. It's closer to white. So it's too bright. And being too bright in the red channel, I'm guessing it has a bit of a reddish cast. There it is. It's got a red cast. All right, well, let's see if we can fix that. First off, non-destructively. What can we use to change the color of something non-destructively? Some kind of layer. Levels could do it. Adjustment layer. We're going to call up a levels adjustment layer. But first we have to figure out what square we're dealing with here. If we look through the column of layers, which square do you think it is? Which layer do you think we've got here? I'm guessing it's the very top one, just based on the location of this square in the corner there. If you're not sure what layer you're dealing with, just turn its eyeball off and on and see what flickers. Just to make sure, let's turn its eyeball off and on. Aha, it is that one. All right. So let's click on it to make it highlighted. And let's call up an adjustment layer. And you can get them from the adjustments panel. I find, since I'm already down here, I go to this little circle, this little half gray, half white circle at the bottom, and there's all my adjustment layers. It says to use levels, so I'm going to throw on a levels adjustment layer. And there it is. All right. We know that the problem was in the red channel. So right now, we're looking at the RGB composite. So this is all three channels. Anything we do here, if we pull the endpoints, if we pull the middle, it's going to affect either the brightness or the contrast of the image because it's working all three channels at the same time. We need to break it down to individual channels. We know it was the red channel that had problems, so let's go to the red channel. Click on that pop-up, and we'll go to red. And now we can grab this middle slider and we can pull it all over the place, but we don't have any idea of what it's becoming, where those numbers are changing to. Well, let's go back to our info panel. And if I hover over 199, 128, 128, now I'm at, well, I haven't really made many changes, 200, 128. Wait a minute, there's two columns here. There's only one column before. Anybody know why there's two columns?
The change one, I guess.
The change, what it has become, and what it once was. Because what we're doing is non-destructive, it's not actually changing the color, this shows what that color actually is, and this shows what it has become. Now, this info and the properties, they're in the same panel right now. To keep the info visible, let's actually grab its tab and rip it out. I'm just going to put my info over there. You can move these panels around as you wish. So I'm going to grab my info, rip it out, and I'll put it over there. Now I can hover over that square anytime I want. I can be working the properties and I can be working the info panel. And when I grab this middle slider on red, I'm going to keep an eye on that 200. So I'll pop over to the, oh, wait, it's changing. What's going on? My readout out here, now I got nothing. Now I got the 200, 120. Now I got something else. We're going to need something other than the info panel. Someone mentioned the eyedropper. There's something that hides out with the eyedropper that will let us get a constant readout in that panel. This panel is giving us a readout in this square of whatever is directly below our cursor. So whatever we hover over, we can see exactly what the RGB values are. But as soon as I leave that square, I lose it up there. Grab your eyedropper and then click on this little pop-up and you'll see a flyout. And in there is a color sampler tool. Let's grab that color sampler tool. And I'm just going to click anywhere in the red. I'm going to stay away from the letters here. So in this little patch up above, I'm just going to do a click. And look at what happens in my info panel. It doesn't matter where my cursor is. This will always change. This is wherever my cursor is. But look, color sampler 1, color sampler 1, 200, 128, 128. Now I can pop over. I can grab that slider and make that square 128, 128, 128. On the red channel, grab that middle slider. And there we go, 128, 128, 128. It now perfectly matches this. Oh, crap. What happened? I made an adjustment layer. I had this layer selected, made an adjustment. It's at the top. It's affecting all the layers below. If we can take this layer and clip it to the layer below, it will only affect that layer. Now, Adobe has given us a bunch of ways of clipping layers to other layers. Simplest way, you'll notice that there's a thin black line in between every one of these layers. If you hold down the Option key and hover over that line, you'll see your cursor change. And if I click on it, look at what happens. Boing. The adjustment layer jumped to the right a few pixels, and this little arrow appeared pointing directly to that red square. So this adjustment layer is now clipped to the red square, which means it's only affecting the red square. And look at this. We use the levels and we match the color. So you can imagine if that shipment of sweaters came in and it says burgundy sweater, and they said, here's the RGB values of that sweater. It has to be that color in the catalog, because when people buy it, that's the color they're expecting to get. And you call it up and you go, well, but the RGB values are a little bit off. Using this technique, you can drop a sampler over the sweater, wiggle around the colors until it's exactly the color that they want. All right, try it on the other two up above. Figure out what the problem is. So go on to the second one. In this case, it looks to be green, but we don't want to assume anything, so I'm going to put a sampler over it, and that's color sampler 2, and it's 128. 207, 128. It is the green channel that has the problem. So I'm going to select its layer, throw on that levels adjustment layer, slip into the green channel, and adjust until I get 128, 128, 127, 130. One of the things you might find, the bigger the change you need to make, the less likely it is that you can get it exact. In this case, the best I can do is 127, and that's okay. You know, as long as you're with 1 or 2 points of it, 127, 129, even 130, I think we'll be okay. All right. Oh, I forgot to clip it. Oh, some other ways of creating clipping masks like this, guys. Take a look on the screen. I showed you holding the Option key, and when you hover over these little lines, you get that symbol. Does this symbol look a little bit like, I don't know, this symbol? If it's an adjustment layer, you can click this symbol to create or release a clipping group. You can also, if you go to the top of the little, what they call the hamburger button up here, there is release or create clipping mask. So that'll release it, and that will create it. The keyboard shortcut, look at this, is Option Command G. You can go under the layers. They give you a bunch of ways of making groups because they are quite handy. All right, I'm going to do the last one. And has anybody tried the second row yet? If you got the top row, try the second row and see if anything goes tragically wrong. You found the problem. So I've thrown a color sampler onto the square on the left there, and I can see from my RGB values that it's 0, so it means there's no red in that channel. In fact, if I look at my channels panel, look at this. Here's the red channel. Oh yeah, it's pure black in there. Here's the green channel, and here's the blue channel. All right. Well, let me do what I did before, because it worked last time. I'll make a levels adjustment layer. And I'll clip it to the layer below because that's the right thing to do. And then I'll grab the red slider because it's the red channel that has a problem. And I'll pull it, okay, and I'll pull it the other, and nothing's happening. In fact, if I unclip it, I can see that something is happening, just nothing's happening to that square. And let's talk about why.
Is it because of the color wheel on opposite side of the color?
Well, yeah, red and cyan are opposite. It's not about the color wheel. It's more about that elastic string. And like I said, 0 down here, 255 up here, black and white. You grab the middle bead and you pull to the left and right. When you pull the middle bead, you can pull it, say, 20 points this way. A bead down here might only move 10 points. A bead down here might only move 5 points. And the closer you get to the ends, the less those beads move. And in fact, there's 2 beads on that string that aren't going to go anywhere. Which 2? 0 and 255, black and white. You can do whatever you want in here. Those beads aren't going to go anywhere. What you need to do is reassign the value of whatever that lowest bead is. So if we could slide that up the string a little bit, we could bring it to 10, 20, or 128. Now, on the levels, there's a different way we have to do that. It's not this middle slider here. It's not these endpoint sliders that we looked at last time. These are your input sliders. These are your output sliders. And if I take this point here, this is saying, well, what is black? Right now, black is 0. But if I move black up and I say, well, let's make black 128. Then we've got 128, 128, 128. Now, this isn't a great way of doing a color correction. In fact, if you tried doing this on a photograph, if I did a levels adjustment here and went into, say, the red channel, and I grabbed this output slider and pulled it upwards, look at what it's doing to the shadows. We're saying, okay, the darkest part in the red channel is no longer 0, it's now 128. And we get this kind of washed out sort of look in the channel. And if I tried doing that on all the channels, let's say, well, let's just take this channel here and this channel here. I can indeed make that square 50% gray, but you'll notice this basically made the entire image 50% gray. In this case, I've said, okay, well, anything that used to be 0, let's make it 128, so we pull this up to here. And anything that used to be white, we'll make it 128. And that's become 50% gray. Anything that used to be in between is also 128. And if everything in the image is 128, 128, 128, the whole thing has become 50% gray. That being said, because of the nature of the 0 in that image, the only thing we can do is pull up the black point. So in the case where the value comes out at 0, you have to use that output. So we go into that red channel, we grab the output, and we heft that one around. So give that a whirl on the other ones. Okay, guys, take a look on the screen for a second. I've done everything right. I put on my number 5 color sampler, and I looked at my RGB 128, 0, 128. I went into my green channel, I pulled my black output level up to 128, so I got 128, 128, 28. I know that that is 50% gray, and yet I'm seeing something wacky going on here. What step did I miss? I didn't clip it, did I? Look at that. Each of these is clipped to the layer. This one is not. So this one, which was fixing this square over here, is affecting everything down below. Watch what happens as soon as I clip it. I know that square is right because I can see those RGB values. And when I clip this one, clip it, and I'll clip this one as well. So make sure you don't forget to clip those layers as you go. And you can easily see there's this little arrow pointing right to the layer below. Now the next ones are kind of interesting. You'll notice that it says use curves to match density, and they also don't have any color cast to them. Take a look on the screen. Let me just take a quick look at these next ones down here. I'm going to throw that color sampler on, and it's giving me 55, 55, 55. What do we know about a color when all the values are the same? When the red channel, the green channel, the blue channel are all the same? On this image here, let's say I threw on a black and white adjustment layer, and if I hover over now, look at the RGB values in this little square up here. 30, 30, 30. If I go into a dark area, 31. Go into a light area, 245, 245, 245. If I can find an area where it's white, 255, 255, 255. They're always the same. Any color where the RGB values are the same will be some shade of gray. And the reason we know that, there's no color cast. If red was a little bit higher, it would be leaning towards red. If red was a little bit lower, what sort of color cast would it have? What's the opposite of red? cyan. It would have a cyanish sort of look to it. If the blue was too high, it would be a bluish cast. If it was too low, it would have a bit of a yellowish cast. So you can tell roughly what sort of color you're looking at just by the RGB values. But whatever color is highest is going to be dominant, and therefore it'll have that sort of color cast. All right. So looking at these ones, it is 55, 55, 55. So I know there's no color cast to this. And if I was using levels, I could just go right onto the RGB. That'll move all three at the same time. But it says to use curves. Is it this one here? Nope. This one here. Use curves to match density. All right. I'll throw on a curves layer. And we looked at curves before. You've got this 45-degree angle and the output sliders that we talked about. Let's talk about input versus output in curves. This is your input. This is whatever the signal, whatever you've sent to it. And this is your output. So if you have an input of 0, you would expect an output of 0. So your file says 0, you want to see 0 on the screen. If you have an input of 255, you would expect an output of 255. So whatever was white should become white. Input of 128, output of 128. But if I were to pull this upwards, let's say I needed to brighten up that square to make it match. I'm going to pull this up a little bit. And I'll put that up to, let me pull this down so we can see. You can actually read the values down here. So I've taken this up. What used to have an input of 128, there's my input, now has an output of 190. So what used to be 50% gray, if there had been something in here, well actually this used to be 50% gray and I haven't clipped it yet. So this used to be 128, it used to be here, now it's up at 190. An input of 128 is giving an input of 190. Now in this one here it says use curves, so we're just going to do 1 point on it and I'm going to pull this higher until I see 128, 128, 128. Now in this case here I am seeing some clipping in the highlights. But it just says use curves to lighten, so we'll use that. I definitely need to clip it though, because as you can see, it's having a huge effect on everything else. So let's clip it, and then do the same on the square on the right. The middle square we're going to ignore because it's the 50% gray. It's the one that we're using as the reference. And same deal, we start with that 45-degree line. Okay, guys, take a look on the screen for a second. On mine, he actually did a better job than I did on mine, because remember I said I was clipping a lot of highlight information. I pulled mine the middle point up and this big honking flat spot. Any tonality that was over here in the brighter parts of the image would be clipped out to white. He actually pulled a lower input to the output. He's still got his 128, but look at this. He's changed the parabola of the file. So this brightened up here faster, but then it tapered off more quickly, so it doesn't actually start clipping until about there. You can modify the shape of this curve. And she had an interesting way of going about it. She just said, well, let's just take this point right here and pull it up. Watch what happens when we do that. Same deal. I'm just going to get rid of this little dot. To get rid of a point on a line, just slip it right off the end. I'm going to grab this output and pull it up. You can see this number falling. This is a lot like taking that output slider and simply pulling it to the left. If we did this on a real photograph, though, take a look at what would happen. Let me call up this image again. And I'll throw on that curves. If we pull this upwards, we're reassigning where 0 is. So 0 in this case has become 133, so we've got that washed out sort of look. There's no pure black in this image. And if we go the other way, anything that's 126 or below has become 0, has become black. And if I went this direction, look at what happens to the image. We end up with all the colors, all the channels being either pure black or pure white. We've basically said, okay, well, anything that used to be 128 or lower has become 0, has become pure black. Anything that was 128 or higher has become white. If I went the other way, though, if I went down this way, what do you think would happen? Here, we took everything and made it either pure black or pure white, just cranked up the contrast. In fact, let me do this on a black and white image. That'll make it easier to see. I'm going to chuck that. I'm going to throw on that black and white. And let me do that curves again. So I'm going to say anything that is 128 or lower will become black. Anything that is 255 down to 128 has become white. So all of this is black, this is white. Notice that pure high contrast. If we zoom in there, there's no shades of gray. Everything is either black or white. What if I took this from vertical to perfectly horizontal? What do you think we would end up with?
What?
If I went this way, we'd end up with white. Okay. If I pulled this up to 128, our blacks have become 50% gray. If I take this to 128, our whites have become 172. If I take it even further, they become 128, pure gray. Now, okay, here's an interesting question. If I took it from horizontal to 45 degrees, but this way, what would we see? This means no change. This means anything that used to be 0 has become 128. Anything that used to be 255 has become 128. What if I kept going to this? Well, let's watch. Whatever used to be 0 is now 255, and anything that used to be 255 is now 0. It becomes a negative version of itself. So hopefully that gives you a better understanding of how that curves works. Okay, back to this one. Now that I've messed everything up, let me just step backwards out of all this. All right, and I'll clip that. Now the very bottom ones, do that bottom row. I think you should find it easy compared to the last 2 rows that we did. More along the lines of the top row, just with a little more work to do. In this case, we've got 62, 181, 64. We know it needs to be 128, 128, 128. We've got problems in all of the color channels. But like I said, we should be able to use those RGB values to figure out what sort of color we're looking at. In this case, the 62 and the 64 are pretty close, so they're kind of balancing each other out. But the middle one, 181, that's way bright. And that's the green channel, so I'm thinking it's probably a fairly bright green. Yes, it is. All right. Same deal, I'll throw on a levels, and I'll nudge everything around. So the red channel, I want to make that 128, as close as I can get it. I think 129 is going to be it. Green channel, 128-ish, and blue channel, 128.